The locomotive did not slow gradually. It stopped. Hard. The brakes hit the iron rails with a shriek that the Texas night carried for half a mile in every direction. The sound of a machine that had been moving with the confident momentum of a scheduled run through safe country and had just encountered something on the track that stopped being safe the moment the Whitley gang arrived. December 1890, the Texas and Pacific Line. Cisco, Texas. The obstruction was deliberate work, carefully placed, calculated to produce exactly the response it produced: the emergency stop, the sudden stillness, the steam venting from the relief valves and rhythmic pulses that sounded to the men inside the darkened cars like something breathing outside that had not been there a moment ago. The men outside were not waiting. They were already moving. William Whitley had been watching this line for weeks, not casually, not the way a man watches something he is merely curious about, the way a man watches something he intends to take, recording the schedule, reading the terrain on both sides of the right-of-way, riding the escape route south into the broken country at night until the darkness and the distance were as familiar to him as the inside of his own coat pocket. The co-leader of what the newspapers would call the Brack Cornett gang, Cornett himself already dead by 1890, the organization continuing under the men who remained, Whitley had selected Cisco with the specific attention of someone who understood that a poorly chosen location was not a risk to be managed. It was a confession, a written confession delivered in boot prints and horse tracks and witness accounts to the Texas Rangers, who would begin reconstructing the event before the locomotive had reached the next station. Flat approach terrain, distance from settlements sufficient to absorb the sound of the stop. Escape into broken country that swallowed mounted men the way the Texas dark swallowed everything it wanted to keep. The selection was not luck. It was craft. The mechanics of forcing a train to stop on a 19th century Texas line were governed by a single psychological reality: what the engineer would and would not accept as a crossing risk. A log across the track was one calculation. A pulled rail was another. A gap in the roadbed was something else entirely. The gang understood the hierarchy. The obstruction placed on the Cisco line that December night was of the specific character that removed the speed clearing option from the engineer's available responses. Substantial enough, positioned precisely enough, that attempting to push through it at any speed was a risk that no man responsible for a locomotive and the lives behind it would accept. The stop was not optional. It was engineered. And the moment the locomotive was still, the moment the mechanical authority of a moving train became the mechanical helplessness of a stopped one, the operational sequence began. Armed men at both ends of the passenger cars. Armed men at the locomotive controlling the engineer and the fireman with the specific persuasion of weapons at close range in the dark. The express car, the primary objective. Its door, its safe, and the specific contents of that safe, on this particular run, on this particular night, the reason 20 men had ridden to this particular stretch of Texas track. The express car door is where the drama lived. On one side, armed men, prepared, patient in the specific way that men are patient when they hold every advantage the situation contains and understand that patience costs them nothing while impatience costs them everything. On the other side, the express agent, alone, trained by the company to resist. Human enough to calculate what resistance in a wooden car against armed men in the dark actually produced in terms of outcomes for the man doing the resisting. The company trained its agents to hold. The dark and the guns and the mathematics of the situation trained them otherwise. The door opened. The safe followed. The passengers who gave their depositions to the Rangers and the express company investigators in the days following described the entire operation, from the first shriek of the brakes to the sound of horses moving fast into the South Texas darkness, as lasting less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes. From stopped locomotive to empty safe to disappearing hoofbeats. 20 minutes of practiced, disciplined, operationally precise work by men who had planned every second of it and executed the plan without the improvisation that planning is supposed to eliminate. Captain Frank Jones of the Texas Rangers received the report and moved. The physical evidence at the Cisco site was already degrading by the time the Rangers reached it. The night and the wind and the passage of time working on the track obstruction and the hoof prints in the soil beside the right-of-way, with the specific indifference of a landscape that does not preserve evidence as a courtesy to the men who need it. Jones worked what remained. The construction of the obstruction, the number of horses, the direction of departure, south, into the broken country, exactly as a man who had ridden those escape routes in darkness would have ridden them. The Rangers rode south. The terrain absorbed them the way it had absorbed Whitley's men, offered no obvious choke points, no natural funneling of pursuit toward a single confrontation that would resolve the matter cleanly. Just the broken Texas country rolling away from the railroad in every direction, with the unhelpful generosity of landscape that makes no distinctions between the men crossing it. Jones rode anyway. The unraveling came not in a single confrontation, but through the accumulated pressure of sustained pursuit and the informant networks the Rangers had spent years cultivating in the communities that outlaw enterprises depended upon for shelter and silence. Piece by piece, source by source, the social infrastructure that had been keeping the gang operational, quietly eroding under the weight of Rangers who had nowhere else to be and no deadline for the being there. William Whitley was taken. The arrest records document it with the flat efficiency of a legal system closing a file. It had been building for months. Tried. The evidence sufficient. The verdict the evidence required. 20 minutes. That was what the Cisco heist cost the Whitley gang in operational exposure. 20 minutes of work on a December night that they had planned with more care and executed with more discipline than most men in their profession managed across an entire career. The Rangers rode for months to answer it. That arithmetic, crime measured in minutes, reckoning measured in seasons, was the specific mathematics of frontier law enforcement. Not fast, not dramatic in the way that a single gunfight is dramatic. Patient, persistent. Operating on the timeline of an institution that understood that the only variable separating a resolved case from an unresolved one was the willingness to keep riding after the tracks had gone cold and the trail had gone thin, and the broken country had done its best to swallow everything the 20 minutes had left behind. The locomotive at Cisco stood in the Texas dark and waited. The Rangers saddled up and rode. They were still riding when Whitley ran out of country to disappear into. He always was going to. The frontier's patience outlasts everything, every single time. Whitley was given a physical introduction, watching the line, riding the escape routes at night, before the planning analysis arrived. The audience sees the man before they are told what the man did. The express car section was expanded from 2 sentences to a full dramatic sequence. The 2 sides of the door, the mathematics of resistance, the moment the door opened. The Captain Jones parenthetical biography was cut entirely. He enters as the pursuing ranger and nothing more. The pursuit accelerates without the interruption. The 20 minutes detail now appears 3 times, at its first establishment in the closing sequence as a callback, and as the pivot against the months of ranger riding. Repetition of the script's single strongest factual anchor amplifies rather than diminishes its impact when the repetition is purposeful.